Welcome to the Lover's Hole, a Patrick O'Brien podcast. As usual, you're with Mike.
And with Ian.
As we are rereading the books of our favorite author, Patrick O'Brien, his Aubrey Maturin series. Ian, we are beginning the final chapter of Post Captain, but catch us up. What happened last time? And are we gonna finish this time?
With pleasure, Mike. Let's get caught up here. Last time, Stephen had found Diana's old place shut up and Diana nowhere to be seen. Jack had improved the gunnery aboard the Lively. Stephen had been demonstrating his surgical technique, and Jack had determined that he would not visit Sophie, saying he has no prospects to offer her if Melville, the current First Lord, should go. This week, Mike, it's going to be worth saying that chapter 14 is so big and rich and fat and unctuous that we are doing it in two parts. So this week, we're covering the first part of chapter 14, in which we have a deeply philosophical Stephen seeming to be an unsuccessful matchmaker for his friends. We have Jack playing not only the interior designer, but the interior designer aboard the Love Boat. We have more plot changes. We have another intelligence mission. We have a copycat Nelson plan gone awry. We get operas, butterfly pronouns, politics, grace, virtue, music, words, art, scent, lots of rain, and plenty of references. Mike, this episode seems to me like it has it all.
You know, it's really a great chapter. It's a great chapter. And, you know, how many can you say, oh, man, it's almost a small book. I love this.
Yeah.
Well, as we open, Stephen asks for Mrs. Williams. He's knocking at the door at Admiral Haddock's place in Plymouth. And Cecilia overhears it, tells the butler, wait, she'll entertain Dr. Maturin. And she tells Stephen how excited they had been, she and Sophie, about the splendid Captain Aubrey taking the Fanchula. She and Sophie had skipped around roaring, huzzah, huzzah, even though they'd been in what she describes as such a taking beforehand. They'd been weeping so much that Cecilia had been swollen and horrid for the Port Admiral's ball, and Sophia had been so upset she'd refused to even go to the ball. Cecilia says she might have thought of us, might have waited until we were all married, and then she catches herself and says, well, you know, I shouldn't be telling you this, Dr. Maturin, because I have heard that you were quite smitten once. And Stephen is looking a little bit confused, and Stephen says, what upset you so much then? Cecilia says, why, Diana, of course. Didn't you know? Oh, Lord.
Wow. And we think the same, right?
Right. What happened to Diana? Oh, my gosh, you know, she's been missing. What's going on here?
True. And Stephen asks the question on our behalf. So tell me, what's happened here? And we learn that Mrs. Williams, the girls' mama, had told them never to mention it, but on this occasion, she'll tell Stephen if he promises in turn not to tell. Di, she says, has gone into keeping with that Mr. Canning. Okay, here's a moment for the dum, dum, dum sound effect. She's in keeping with Mr. Canning, and it had put Mrs. Williams in a horrid rage, ruining the girl's chances of a decent marriage, so she said. And hearing Sophie coming along here, Cecilia leaves the scene saying she doesn't want to be a gooseberry. And gooseberry, or gooseberry if you're from the South, is a cute UK usage meaning somebody who is the third wheel, the person who's around when two people, potentially good friends or lovers, want to be left alone. So there you go. She doesn't want to be the gooseberry. Stephen passes on some news of his own to Sophie now that she's on the scene. Tells Sophie that Jack has been made post, and looking through the Admiral's telescope, he shows her Jack standing on the quarterdeck of the Lively. And Sophie sees the bandage on Jack's head, worried about it, and Stephen says it's nothing, not more than 12 stitches, which is nothing for Stephen's world, but I think Sophie would be a bit worried about that. Why doesn't he come, she says, meaning why doesn't he come and visit? And this again is a question that we got answered right at the end of the previous chapter. Stephen explains that if Jack set foot on shore, he would be arrested for debt. No friend of his, says Stephen, would stop him by force. No woman with any heart of friendship in her would ask it. And that was very well put by Stephen, I think. And Sophie backs down right away. No, no, of course, I was forgetting. And Mike, it seems to me that Stephen's turning over different ways in which a woman can be a friend to a man here, right?
Yeah, yeah. I love this idea, that Stephen's thinking, yeah, Diana clearly was neither a friend nor a woman with a heart of friendship, because she constantly was luring Jack ashore and putting him in danger. And he knows Sophie wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
Sophie feels that she and Jack's eyes are meeting every time he looks up at the house as she's staring through this telescope. And she's just gushing about how is he? It seems like he's not doing that well. And then she asks Stephen how he is, and she clearly sees that Stephen's not doing so well. And she says, "Oh, Sissy must have been prattling." And Stephen says, "Is it true?" And Sophie takes Stephen's hand to console him just as Admiral Haddock pops in the door, sees them, cries, "I beg your pardon," and immediately leaves. And this will come back. Stephen tells her that the Lively will be sailing up the channel, escorting soldiers very soon, that Sophie needs to go aboard this afternoon and ask for a lift to the Downs. Stephen's like, boom, all right, it's time for major action here. And she says, my gosh, I could never do that. It would be improper, forward, pushing, bold. And Stephen says, with your sister Cecilia going along with you, it's perfectly proper. You need to start packing now because Jack is likely to be in the West Indies next month. In other words, quarter of the way across the world. This is it, kid. It's now or never.
Right. And I love about Stephen, of course, that he's just had his heart broken in his internal world anyway by the news that Diana is away with Canning. And he's able to continue a conversation where he's helping his friends Jack and Sophie to get it together. What a guy. What a friend.
Right.
Now, she knows that Stephen means this hurry and urgent advice. He means it kindly. She regards him as a darling, a really, really tender, close friend. But she says to him, young women can't do these kinds of things. Now, Stephen starts to lose patience. I have no time at all. None, Akushla, said Stephen, rising. So listen now. Do what I say. Pack your bonnet. Go aboard. Now is the time. Now, while there will be 3,000 miles of salty, unhappy sea between you and a waste of years. It's beautifully put again, but it's not yet landing home with Sophie. She's very confused. She's stuck in this world of I can't, I will not, he might not want me. And she starts crying and she's muttering to herself, no, 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 not ever. And he's got to go. Good day to you now, Sophie, he says. How can you be so simple, so missish? Fie, Sophie, where's your courage, girl? Sure, it is the one thing in the world he admires.
Wow.
And we get a couple of really fascinating things in this piece from Stephen here. One is we get a bit of charming Irishness, but besides that, it is the one thing in the world he admires, which is a lovely bit of sort of Anglo-Irish usage. He talks about her as a kushla. Now, Mike, I think I remember that I look forward to, is it the Yellow Admiral, where he has a favorite horse called Lala, who he addresses as a kushla. But this is an Irish word, an Irish Gaelic word, meaning darling. But it more literally has a connection to blood. It's a pulse or vein. And Mike, I think you and I have both seen the really great movie with Clint Eastwood and Hilary Swank, $1 Million Baby. And he has Mo Kushla, I think, embroidered on her walk-on robe or on her gloves, or I can't remember where. But it's a movie that leaves everybody with a profound impression of what the word means and the depth of the sentiment behind it.
Yeah. And I think he's got this akushla, and then, he's saying about her being so mishish. And I thought, mishish, reserved, quiet, shy, squeamish. And then, phi, and I hear phi all the time, fee, fi,
Right.
fo, flum, and all that. But I never really actually said, what does that mean? Phi, Sophie, because he, especially when Patrick Tall reads this, I thought, yeah, I should find that. Well, it's an expression of disgust or outrage. So I've always kind of had it a little lighter, but I think Stephen is saying, look, he's pretty clear here. So I love this. He's wrapped everything up. He's trying to, he's making his final argument to the jury, and then he's got to run. So, but
Brilliant.
apparently it's not landing here.
By the way, Mike, on Phi, I've just as we've been speaking here, I did a quick look on our old friend Google Ngram. There's a Google Ngram peak of 1804 for the word Phi.
Oh my
So
goodness.
absolutely
Whoa.
spot on.
For those of you who've been sailing with us for a long time, you know that, early on too, it was like we were always so amazed that O'Brien would pick the words, in exactly the time he's writing. So you're right, Ian. I hadn't even thought to look back at that. Brilliantly done. I like that.
Very good. Now, it's a moment of deep, profound emotion for Stephen, and that takes him into deep, profound reflection. And where does he do that? He does that in his diary. So he's in Dock, which is a suburb of Plymouth, which is a very well-named suburb for a harbour town. And he's writing in his diary that this place has more wretchedness, misery, and squalor than any other naval port. He compares it to the way Sodom outran Gomorrah for just outright nastiness. And walking along the street, he's solicited by the barbarous inhabitants of this town, male and female, and epicene, meaning having characteristics of both sexes. That and his view of the poorhouse with all of the filth, cruelty, and bestial ignorance left a lasting impression of unhappiness. Stephen calls it meaningless, absolute unhappiness. And we're going to hear a lot in this half of this chapter from Stephen on the meaninglessness of the experiences that he has. But this experience was so bad that he couldn't feel indignation. He could just feel this sickness, what he calls a hopeless nausea. So, Mike, we had correspondence with the diary as one place where Stephen goes to reflect and recover. I feel some music coming on here.
Yeah, it's interesting. He does. He's caught in this. I think he's in this little suburb of Dock in the midst of all this, and he says just by chance, he keeps his appointment with the chaplain to listen to some music that his mind was so caught up in this hopeless nausea, but his feet carried him on to the music. And then this music is your forte. So I've got to turn this over to you here. Tell him, he writes about this music in his diary.
He does. He has kept an appointment with the chaplain to go and listen to some music. And he describes it like this. Curious music, he says, well played, particularly the trumpet. A German composer, one Molter. He's talking about Johann Melchior Molter of this parish. We'll come back to Molter another time. The music, says Stephen, had nothing to say, but it provided a pleasant background of cellos and woodwinds and allowed the trumpet to make exquisite sounds, pure colour tearing through this formal elegance. And we've had some colour. We've had our little bit of synesthesia in the last episode where we were perceiving music as colour. And Stephen goes on, I grope to define a connection that is half clear to me. I once thought that this was music, much as I thought that physical grace and style was virtue, or replaced virtue, or was virtue on another plane. But although the music shifted the current of my thoughts for a while, they are back again today. And I have not the spiritual energy to clarify this or any other position. And Mike, I'm looking at this from two ways. One way is maybe we're talking about Stephen finding that everything is turning to ashes in his mouth in his current mindset. Color and delight and joy and music and art and grace aren't quite what they were. So he goes to hear Malta and he doesn't find that it's quite the thing. Maybe also it's actually true that Malta is not quite the thing. Well, listen out for some more references to music as the chapter goes on. But and anyhow, between this and the diary entry, Mike, it's going pretty deep.
It really is. And it's fascinating to me. And, he's speculating in the music. And then all of a sudden he jumps over to this whole thing about physical grace and virtue. And to me, this is like, all right, all the time when Stephen talks about Diana and thinking about Diana, it's always about her physical grace and virtue, style, or, as they say, virtue on another plane. And so this whole thing is, I'm wondering, as we're kind of swirling deeper and deeper into Stephen's mind and emotion right now, what's going on? This news, like you say, of Diana becoming Canning's mistress, and but I think let's not go too deep here, because Stephen continues to dig in for us. He continues to kind of keep unpacking this this Russian doll of emotions here. Yeah.
Right. And his mind turns to a stone, a Roman stone that he's known at home. And carved on it is this quote in Latin, fui non sum non curo. And as he's thinking about that, he thinks about the peace that he has felt. He calls it in Latin, tranquillitas animi et indolentia corporis. And Mike, after I've mangled 2 phrases worth of Latin, you've got to help us out here. I think that we might have had some advice from a good friend who can help us decode what's going on here, right?
Yeah, God bless Karen Ruff.
Yeah.
She is, our consulting medieval Latinist. We were wrestling with this a good bit, and we actually talked about it once later in the canon. This first thing, it's been called the Epicurean epitaph, and it's kind of, Stephen does it in a partial way. It's usually in a fuller way. This, I think here, I didn't exist. I don't exist now. I care not. In the fuller form is I was not. I was. I am not. I care not. Kind of in the sense, if you go back to the guide to the perplex on the gun rooms, hmssurprise.org, says kind of, I came from nowhere and now I've gone. What does such a fleeting life matter anyway? And so Stephen's saying that this phrase, and this phrase sometimes actually in just letter form or in other forms, is actually on a lot of gravestones, a lot of Roman gravestones. And it kind of, goes from the early Greek philosopher into some of the Roman Stoic thoughts too. But, the fascinating thing, it's not just like, okay, life's too short. You can't let it get to you. Don't worry about that. And there's no, a big part of that is there's no afterlife you have to be worried about. No, nothing you need to do there. But Stephen thinks about this and says that, the second Latin tag that you had there, about how it makes him feel. And, Karen dug into that and talks about insensibility. And we hear a little bit of that in the thing, but it's freedom from pain, something that Cicero had kind of coined, meaning the opposite of suffering. But fascinatingly, this idea of sense and sensibility, we've been
Ooh.
wrestling this, Karen's like, gosh, you know what? Boom. We're back from Stephen's Latin tag into Cicero, into Jane Austen. And this whole chapter is like this, with the music, with the Latin, with so many things, where O'Brien is just magically interweaving the warp and weave of our characters' lives, and
So
you know,
clever.
things through the ages here. So I love this here. Karen also says, I love the idea of Stephen lounging insensible by a gravestone, that insensibility that he otherwise finds in laudanum. But now this insensibility, as he's listening to his night jars, or what we might call night hawks, these beautiful bird
Mm.
calls there. So Stephen moves from this thought to saying that, he was lounging by this stone and thinking about this inscription because it happened at home. And we remember in Master and Commander, he actually is sitting there right at that stone when put ashore in Catalonia one time. But I'd like to say that his feelings are kind of betraying this peace of mind, this I don't care attitude, because
Yeah.
clearly he's feeling pretty deeply here right now. He cares about some things very deeply, but despite that, he's telling himself that he won't. He says that he still has, he continues to go on writing, a glow of hatred for the Spaniards, thinking about home, under these indulgent, unmanly ashes. Now he's saying, yeah, I would like to say I don't care, but I have
Yeah.
indulgent, unmanly ashes. So when I'm kind of put my ashes in the ground, he says, I still have a living attachment to Catalan independence. So he does care. He
Right.
does care about some of these things. So I'm wondering what's going on here. These thoughts, are these things, O'Brien's come back to this gravestone in Master and Commander. He's come back to it in Post Captain. Are these things pressing on Stephen's mind? Are these things pressing on O'Brien's mind? Or are these things that give him comfort? I don't know. And I guess
Mm.
he's maybe letting us wrestle in our own lives. What do these do for us?
Right, right, right. And I guess if this was all coming up fresh in one of the very, very late books like Yellow Admiral or Blue at the Mizzen, we might think about it differently. But here, he's much more in the kind of main flow of his life. He's certainly at the beginning of this journey with these books. Good, good, good. Anyhow, we're not done with reflecting on the squalor around Plymouth here because Stephen pauses and he looks out of the cabin window at the floating filth in the harbour and continues with another paragraph in his journal here. Yet, on the other hand, will this glow, he means the glow of the old hatred or attachment to independence that we were just talking about, will this glow ever blaze up again when I think of what they'll do with independence? When I let my mind dwell on the vast potentiality for happiness and our present state? Such potentiality and so much misery? Hatred the only moving force, a petulant, unhappy striving, childhood the only happiness, and that unknowing, and then the continual battle that cannot ever possibly be won, a losing fight against ill health, poverty for nearly all of life. Life is a long disease with only one termination, and its last years are appalling. Weak, racked by the stone, rheumatismal pains, senses going, friends, family, occupation gone. A man must pray for imbecility or a heart of stone. All under sentence of death, often ignominious, frequently agonizing. And then the unspeakable levity with which the faint chance of happiness is thrown away for some jealousy, tiff, sullenness, private vanity, mistaken sense of honour. That deadly, weak, and silly notion. And that's right up with all of the really great weighty paragraphs of Stephen Matcham reflecting on life. And he's not just talking about himself now, is he, Mike? This seems like he's thinking about mankind. And in particular, I think he's thinking about his friends, Jack and Sophie, right? As well as himself and Diana.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. That last sentence, I think finally, all of this rumination leading up to this, I think was Stephen mining deeper down, deeper down, deeper down to where is this coming from right now? And
Yeah.
that's it. What's happened with Diana, how it happened, how it drove him and Diana apart. And now I think it's what's happening with Sophie and Jack. I think he's thinking it's all over for him and Diana, but he's just completely racked by these two people that he loves throwing away their happiness for what he sees as these inane reasons in the last thing. He said, I think Diana has done that. We've kind of gotten that. Let's not let this happen to Jack and Sophie here. But he's now kind of gone all the way down and he pulls back and he says, well, I know that my perceptions are not always right. Maybe I haven't quite gotten this right, as my conduct with Diana proved. But it's, he was just certain that Sophie had what he writes as more bottom, more straightforward, direct, courageous. And he says, well, maybe that's because I know the depths of Jack's feelings for her and she doesn't. And as he's writing this, he looks up through the cabin window and he looks right into Sophie's eyes. And I thought, what? Wait a minute. Is this like an illusion, a dream? No, no. And I just love this one. She's right there below the cabin window. She is in a boat with Admiral Haddock and Cecilia, and she's looking up past the cabin. But as Stephen looks out, he's looking right at her face. So he's writing this, and there she is. There she is. So all of this, oh my God, it's not going to work. It's not coming together. This is awful. Wait, she's right where he asked her to be. I love this.
I love
But
it too.
he points out, Sophie has this look of absolute, contained alarm on her face. So she's doing it, but she's a little bit scared to death at the same time. Ah, what a great moment.
Oh, and I love how it's discomforting to both Stephen and Sophie. But fantastic news, right? He was successful in persuading at least one person of one thing. He was successful in persuading Sophie that she and her sister ought to at least approach the ship with a view to coming aboard. And here we are. We're up on deck. He sees Jack talking with the Admiral, Admiral Haddock, and he sees Sophie standing on the deck but some distance off. He thinks that Jack is looking anxious, maybe a bit dismayed at the unexpected call here. He seems to be answering the Admiral rather at random, and meanwhile the Admiral is telling the girls about the ship. So, says the Admiral, I entrust the girls to you, Aubrey. I shift the responsibility onto your shoulders. 2 great girls is a very shocking responsibility, and send them aboard on Thursday. And now here's Jack. Upon my word, sir, you are very good, but not fit for a lady. That is to say, very fit for a lady, but cramped. Should be very happy, more than happy, to show Miss Williams any attention in my power. Oh, never mind, says the Admiral. Never mind them. They're only girls, you know. They can rough it. Don't put yourself out. Think what you will save them in pin money. Stow them anywhere. Berth them with a doctor. Ha ha. There you are, Dr. Maturin. I'm happy to see you. You would not mind it, eh? Eh? Ha ha ha. I saw you, you sly dog. Take care of him, Aubrey. He is a sly one. And friendly but gossipy and rather gauche Admiral Haddock I think he's done about almost as much damage as he can do here. And off he goes with the girls in tow, with this appointment now made for them to come back on the Thursday. And the Admiral quietly tells Jack that Jack's father's speech to Parliament had been on the subject of the Navy and had said that his son, i.e. Jack, had told him, i.e. the General, that the former administration, who might be about to become the next administration, had allowed, nay, encouraged the grossest laxity and unheard of corruption, unfit people promoted through influence, and women allowed on board with unspeakable debauchery. This is again the words of General Aubrey in Parliament here. The Admiral advises Jack, if he possibly can, to have his father stick to commenting on the army in his speeches in Parliament. So parents can do that, can't they? They're right. They can embarrass you even when they're not immediately close by.
Yeah, they can embarrass you, and in Jack's cases, they can really crimp your professional possibilities here. You know, if they go on and on and on.
Just like in the Philip Larkin poem, which we're not going to go into right now.
Well done. I thought it was like kind of funny when I was first reading this. First, I thought, what is this about Maturin, you sly dog? And then I realized, oh, right. He walked in just as Sophie took Maturin's hand earlier, thinking, oh, there's something between them here, right? But, I was also kind of struck that we're on this ship full of wigs, and it's all kind of, we don't have flashy anything. Haddock, he comes from a much older Navy where they're a lot cruder, and Jack inherited a little bit of that too. And so the livelies around them are kind of like, they're a little put off by this whole thing. What this is not like Dashwood's sister coming aboard and slinging her cot. We'll get more into that. Yeah, this sounds like it's got a little bit of not right to it here. Well, sure enough, Jack starts to kind of play into their thinking, I think.
Right. He has everyone set to work prettifying the ship. And this means he's going to need some help, at the very least, from his first lieutenant. So he sends for Simmons and asks Simmons to send him the man aboard who has the best artistic taste, a sense of the sublime. And I can't think of how few occasions in the history of His Majesty's Royal Navy has anyone ever sent for the man aboard with a sense of sublime. But there you go. It certainly sounds a little odd coming out of Jack's mouth compared to how it sounded in the conversation between Stephen and MacDonald a couple of chapters ago. Simmons has got the answer, though. He says, we need to send for Mallet. He's a member of the crew of the Lively. He's a former receiver of stolen property who knows the old masters. So before we get into Mallet, Mike, let's just talk about what Jack is doing here. Sophie's been on the deck of the ship for the grand total of a bare few minutes. They've hardly exchanged words, but all of a sudden, Jack has moved from trying to lead and earn the respect of the ship's company and the ship herself, an efficient, albeit rather boring, example of Whiggish rationalism. He's trying to turn it from being that into being something completely other.
Love, exciting and new. Come aboard, we're expecting you. And love.
So, Mike, I can just about remember The Love Boat on TV, but I have a feeling you can remember it even better than I can, right?
Oh, this was 1976, I think, that it premiered. Ran for 10 seasons. So I was actually out of college. So, but I do remember it was great fun, and it's maybe we can pop that the trailer. It had great stars that would do guest roles. It had great characters. And I can almost kind of going back through that trailer say, yeah, Jack's sort of like the person. No, Jack's sort of like that. Yeah, Jack's kind of like that. Yeah, it's just hilarious. I think it absolutely captures what's about to happen here on The Lively.
Yeah, and it's funny. I was scrolling down the headshots of the members of the cast on the Wikipedia page for The Love Boat earlier on. I'm thinking there's a very large number of implausibly good-looking women compared to any other naval story I've ever come across.
Well, women, men, all kinds of guest stars, and everybody winking, nodding, smiling. It's not, it's just hilarious. It's great.
Well, let's find out what Jack is going to do to try and reach the sublime heights of the Love Boat.
Well, Jack is going to go straight for what women care most about, Nelson.
Yeah.
He says, okay, I want to impress the women. So I want the sailmaker to make a Nelson checker sailcloth carpet for the cabin. And I need lots more room. We've got to make this much more spacious. So he calls for the carpenter to, move the bulkhead just 18 inches, because that's a lot more room in the world of the Navy. I'm sure for women they wouldn't notice that it had changed, but anyway, when Stephen returns, Jack calls him his hero. I think Jack realizes that this didn't just come out of the blue. Stephen had set this up, and he gives him this huge one-armed bear hug. And I'm thinking, here's Jack on deck with all the sailors around, and I just want to rock my friend in a hug. But of course, like trains, planes, and automobiles, guys can't be doing that quite. So a big stiff one-armed bear hug, and he says, "Ain't you delighted and amazed?" And Jack tells him that, look, I got some money from my prize agent. I want to spend whatever it takes to improve the cabin, and I want your ideas. What do we do? I really want to impress the girls here. And Stephen says, well, you're going to need another hanging bed and a simple cot and proper blankets. Stephen's the man here. Talk about your enlightened rationalism. Yes, this is what you need. Jack says, no. And he tells him, we're going to shift the bulkhead forward 18 inches. And Stephen, I must ask you to put your bees ashore. And boy, now Stephen is incensed, right? What? We didn't do that for Mrs. Miller. Jack says, by my sacred honor, I could just see him holding his hands over his heart. I would put my bees ashore for you, Stephen. And then he says, wait, he's got this great idea. Whatever Nelson thought, not bad with the ladies. Probably it was his silver plate. So, Stephen, would you do me this great favor? Would you run ashore and buy 4 silver plates just like Nelson had? And he'd say, Stephen, I believe I've told you how I dined with Lord Nelson. Stephen says, yeah, not above 200 or 300 times. we know how this has been running with him. And Jack, is saying, now, okay, remember, Stephen, the plates have to have a hawser-laid rope border, the rim in the form of a hawser-laid rope. And remember that. It's going to come back here. But then Ian, we're back to Mallet. Tell us about Mallet.
I love Mallet. Is this got this kind of cultural sensitivity that's not really expected in A Man of the Sea? He is sent into town along with Bonden to buy some ornaments to make the cabin fit for a lady. A vast, great looking glass, curtains, little chairs, and a pouf or pouffet, a little kind of footstool thing. Mallet asks, in what taste, sir? Chinoiserie? Classical? Directoire? And by the way, he's checking out these names of all these different artistic styles. at least one of which is a bit of an anachronism, but never mind. Exactly how stylish would you like this to be, sir? And Aubrey doesn't know. He's handing it straight over to Mallet in the best style, Mallet, says Jack. And I love the character of Mallet. He's kind of like an effete, highbrow version of Killick. And when we first read this book through, I compared him to the character Bernard in The West Wing, who mocks C.J. Craig's taste in necklaces and blouses. I think if this was the 1970s, Mallet wouldn't be in the Royal Navy. He'd have an art gallery on the King's Road. And if it was today in 2024, I think Mallet would be an Instagram influencer.
Nice.
But Mallet's great. So he's going to take care of the style and the soft furnishings and the feng shui and all the rest of it. So Jack's needs are going to be taken care of, but it means a taxing time for Stephen, right?
Well, it's fascinating because apparently this just goes into full effect all across the ship. And, Stephen, he told Sophie that he's going to have to be leaving here. He's really, really busy. And as you say, Ian, his last days aboard the ship are very taxing, that the cabin is scrubbed continuously. It's now most of the cabin is off limits, Stephen. You can't step in there. We're saving that. It's got to be perfect for the girls here. Stephen's thinking, I've had to lie in this disagreeable proximity to Jack, who's snorting and tossing all night. And Stephen reflects that the general atmosphere aboard the Lively is a lot more like the Polycrest on the verge of mutiny. They're being asked to do all this stuff, scrub the boat below the waterline, comb the lambs out. We've got lambs for Sophie for dinner, but we have to have them combed every day. They have to be beautiful. And I think these Livelies are not happy. And in the meantime, they're watching their captain, who is laughing, snapping his fingers, and skipping heavily about the deck. So this is really good. And I love O'Brien's reflection. He writes, the married officers looked at him with malignant satisfaction. Yeah. And the rest of the crew with disapproval. So I thought this is so, oh my God, O'Brien, you've got us so absolutely pegged here.
Yeah, I think we all feel a bit seen by that, don't we? Anyhow,
Right.
this is sounding great. Jack Aubrey's trying to get his interior decoration game on. Stephen, meanwhile, visits Sophie back at the Admiral's and tells her a little bit, I think, about what to expect from being in close proximity with Jack. Jack, he says, has changed. He's lost much of the gaiety of his heart, even though you can't tell that at the moment. He describes his character as being, these days, more somber, less inclined to make friends, and in this particular ship, in the Lively, more remote from his officers and crew. However, he suffers frustration with more patience and cares less passionately about many things. So he's kind of describing Jack as becoming a bit of a stoic, slightly in the way that we were talking about earlier on. The boy in him, he means the boy in Jack, the young Jack who was kind of always there but just beneath the surface, has vanished. And the piratical youth that Stephen first met back at the beginning of Master and Commander, he says is also gone. And to complete the picture here, Stephen says, but when a man puts on maturity and invulnerability, it seems that he necessarily becomes indifferent to many things that gave him joy. I do not, of course, refer to the pleasure of your company, he added, seeing her look of alarm. But he goes on and describes Jack Aubrey as having become a better officer, but a duller man. Stephen says that he's worried about Jack's future. There are changes coming in Whitehall. He's going to have less influence. There are, meanwhile, hundreds of unemployed post captains. There are 101 frigates, and there are 639 post captains on the list, of which Jack is the 587th. So he's a long way down from being a shoo-in for a frigate command of his own anytime soon. And Sophie wonders whether it's not a very good thing, then, that Jack's father, General Aubrey, is in Parliament. Doesn't that give him some influence? And, well, that may be, explains Stephen, thinking back to the message from Admiral Haddock earlier on, that maybe if only the General would keep his mouth shut and stop stamping Jack as a double-dyed Tory, along with St. Vincent and all his friends being Whigs, and the general feeling of the service being Whiggish to a degree. So it's kind of putting a bit of a dampener on the expectations that Sophie had, which is kind of sad, right? He was egging her on to say, come aboard and, reach an understanding with the love of your life. But now he's sitting here telling her, well, the love of your life, he ain't quite so lovely anymore.
Although he's doing a smart thing, under promise, over deliver. Let's tamp down
Right.
I got you on. Now let me set you up. Let's don't keep those expectations of that Jack you saw before. It's going to be different here.
Ah, good.
Sophie, bless her, she's still optimistic. She's still, we're going to make this happen. She says, well, maybe Jack will take a splendid prize with this great ship. How the Admiral talks about the Lively here. And Stephen says, well, there's very few prizes left at sea now, none of the splendid merchant prizes like at the beginning of the war. And Jack would have to cut out a dozen Fanchulas to pay off his debt. And he says Jack is going to be coming to see Sophie on Sunday, and he hopes that she'll keep him there at the Admiral's as long as she can so that the crew doesn't break out in open rebellion here. And we get Stephen describing to her about combing the lambs, and they have this cute discussion about lambs. Wait a minute, where are lambs on the ship? I've been reading the Marine Dictionary, and they get into all the parts of the ship. But Sophie hopes that Stephen will come along with Jack. She's thinking this will kind of ease that transition. But Stephen says, he's got to run one more errand for Jack, and then tonight he's going to be on the evening coach. He writes down his address, gives it to Sophie, says, write me in London. And so, this kind of puts Sophie back on her heels a little bit. Shall you not be coming, Stephen? Cried Sophia, clasping his arm. What will happen to me? No, my dear, I cast you adrift. Sink or swim, Sophie, sink or swim. Where's my hat? Come on, give me a bus, and I must away. A bus, an old, I guess, is this an English word for kiss, Ian?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. I guess it comes from French, baiser, to kiss, which is used in a much more crude way nowadays, but I think it's the same thing. It's a bus. So, again, high spirits from Stephen, despite the fact that he's in the depths of despair. And he's, as you say, really skillfully maneuvering for Jack and Sophie to have some kind of an understanding grow here. He goes back aboard the ship, and now he has to do his own bit of coaching in turn for Jack, who is, it seems, overdoing the preparations a little bit. He says to Jack, listen, if you keep watering the plants with the water that you wash and drink twice a day from, they will surely wilt. They need fresh rainwater from the shore. And if those plants are going to live through anything like the constant overwatering that Jack is going to give them, then he'll need aquatic plants. So kind of calm down here. Maybe he needs to find somebody alongside Mallet who knows something about houseplants. I'm sure there's somebody aboard the Lively. Never mind. Jack invites Stephen to give an opinion on the completed cabin now that we have the cushions and the throws and the mirrors and the chinoiserie and all the rest of it. Silently observing the place, Stephen thinks that it resembles a cross between a brothel and an undertaker's parlor, which is a great image. And he agrees with Mrs. Armstrong, who says she's never seen anything like it and had suggested that he probably still needs somewhere to hang clothes. Good advice, Mrs. Armstrong. And maybe a pin cushion. Stephen agrees with this. He also says it would look a bit less like a state funeral if the tubs with the flowers in were perhaps not so rigidly arranged around the cots. So I love the comedy which comes from the reactions of people, right? Well, Brian doesn't got to describe it to us. He describes it through the eyes of Stephen and Mrs. Armstrong, and that's really, really funny. There's more comedy still to come, Mike, because Stephen's completed an errand for Jack, right? He's got these plates from ashore.
Right. He's run back ashore to get these plates for Jack. Jack thanks him, and he's unwrapping them. He's seeing the back, and he says, "Oh, how they shine." He turns them over, and his face falls. And he says, "Stephen, I don't want to seem ungrateful, but I told you the border was to be hawser laid." And Stephen said, "Well, didn't I tell the shopman to put a hawser around the periphery? And the shopman told me that it's as pretty a hawser as Lord Viscount Nelson himself could desire." And Jack agrees. "Oh, it is a capital hawser." And O'Brien writes, "But surely, my dear Stephen, you must be aware after all this time at sea that a hawser is cable laid, not hawser laid." And Stephen loses it. "I am not. And I absolutely decline to hear more of the matter. A hawser, not hawser laid. What stuff! I badgered the silversmith early and late, and we are to be told that hawsers are not hawser laid? No. The wine is drawn, it must be drunk. The frog has neither feathers nor wool, and yet she sings. You will have to sail up to the downs, eating the bread of affliction off your cable-laid baubles and wetting it with the misery of your tears. You know, your tears of misery. And I may tell you, sir, that you will eat it without me. boy, that's a speech. That's a speech and
Oh,
a
that's
half.
great.
And then Stephen says, I'm being called away on essential business. I'll be at the Grapes when I'm in London. I hope I'll be back in London before Michaelmas. Drop me a line.
Oh, watching it with tears of misery. We should dig into this because Stephen's speech is so erudite and flows so well. We have a feeling that maybe some of this was already at Patrick O'Brien's fingertips. Let's start with the wine is drawn, it must be drunk. There's a French proverb that goes, quand le vin est tiré, il faut le boire. When the wine has been drawn, it must be drunk. We must drink it. Which says that whenever you start something, you should finish it. You should see things through. It can also mean that you take responsibility and you should own up to and own your mistakes. The frog having neither feathers nor wool, and yet she sings, Mike, I don't think we can find anything to suggest that this comes from anywhere other than O'Brien's imagination. Seems to be Stephen's way of saying, don't limit your expectations based on stereotypes. We expect that birds sing. Frogs are not birds, but they sing. These plates will sing, he seems to be saying. These plates will sing just as well as Nelson's, if you would just get over your quibble about hawsers. So there you go. Stephen's being erudite in his own right. The bread of affliction. Can you help us out with where that one comes from, Mike?
Oh yeah, this is I just like this stuff is coming from all different directions. This is a strong biblical one, and if you grew up in the Jewish tradition doing a Passover Seder, you'll remember the bread of affliction.
Yeah.
This is when Pharaoh has the Jews in slavery in Egypt, and God sends Moses and the 10 plagues, and the last plague is the death of all the firstborn children. But you've got the Passover that, if you do the right sacrifice and paint your doors, that, the Jewish kids are not going to be taken here. And once that Passover comes, the Jewish people, it's all the firstborn die. Pharaoh says, okay, get out of here. I want you to go now, but you need to go now. And the people have to run right away before Pharaoh changes his mind. And so they don't allow their bread to rise. They just take that, they run out to the desert with it, and then they have to eat all this unleavened bread. And so this is celebrated every year. It's, my Jewish friends will tell me it's tasteless. It's got some digestive properties that you don't want this Mazda that you eat for 7 days every year as part of the Feast of Passover. So that's the bread of affliction. And it's in Deuteronomy, when you're getting the instructions about this, referring back to what happened in Exodus, you get this, this is the bread of affliction, and it's, the only moisture you get in that is your own tears, thinking about you were slaves and you were saved. But for my Christian friends, you'll remember that the first communion was with Jesus and the disciples at the Feast of Passover. So the first communion was Mazda. So, again, the bread of affliction, but we don't have to go there. I think perhaps this is Stephen's way of saying, look, I'm not your slave.
Right.
Before he does his flight out of Egypt, his rapid departure. And, kind of like the Seder, perhaps, eating on your not so perfect plates will remind you that you had it much worse in days before. You got silver plates now, shut up. Eat your thing here.
Well, it's funny. I love how we're talking about the context of fleeing, and we're talking about punishment being in the form of dry, tasteless, unappetizing food and drink. That sets us up really nicely for one of those really rapid O'Brien changes of point of view. And we go from dry to wet, and we go from bland to delicious, because Stephen's on a mission. He's in Catalonia, where there are plenty of grapes to be harvested. He leaves the abbot of Montserrat, who he had been once to see already in the ill-fated trip that triggered the dispute and the duel with Jack way back, seems like a lifetime ago, but just a few chapters ago in this book. And he rides westward across the country through the autumn into the rainy Basque country, soaked to the skin, and it continues to rain on him all the way back across the Bay of Biscay, across the Channel, up to the Admiralty with an urgent piece of intelligence requiring a political decision. The First Lord and Sir Joseph are in Windsor, returning the next morning. And as another little echo of language from one paragraph or one idea to the next, we were talking about the grapes of Catalonia. Now we have the grapes as in the Savoy, right, Mike?
Right, right. And, we could even go from the grapes of the communion to the grapes of Catalonia to the
Right,
grapes
right.
being shut up. I don't know. But, the grapes are shut up. And Stephen, it's the middle of the night. He's cold. He's miserable. It's wet. He's even thinking, maybe we should check into the Turkish baths, which has a great also history behind it. But, the coachman's sort of having none of it. He goes up and he's pounding on the shutters with his whip one last time. And Mrs. Broad finally wakes up and says, "Oh my gosh, it's so good to see you, Dr. Maturin. We've been waiting for you. We've had a fire in your room the last 2 nights. Come on in." And she brings him, her late husband, the late Mr. Broad's flannel garment to put on. And as she's fixing him a little something, Stephen is getting changed, looking at himself, and he realizes that all over his body, the garments that he's been wearing and the different colors have soaked through his skin to the blood. And I thought, I'm not exactly sure what O'Brien's getting at here, but it's been a heck of a trip for him here, right? He's got this, this Catalonia down to the blood here. And he's he's asked for an egg and some wine. Mrs. Broad returns with egg, gammon, glass of wine, and some letters that had come from him. And he reads first Sophie's letter as he's eating. And she starts by saying, this letter is going to be filled with tears. I'm trying to keep them off the letter, but, a lot of them are going to fall here. Most of them are pure, undiluted happiness because, Captain Aubrey and I have come to an understanding. Neither of us will marry anyone else ever. Yay. And she said, it's not a secret engagement. That would be wrong. But I do feel perhaps my conscience has grown much more elastic than ever before. She says, but I know, Stephen, you'll know the difference between these two. And so Stephen's saying, okay, so you said most of these are happiness, pretty much all of them. And he's kind of flipping through her saying thanks and flipping through what happened and how it happened, going, where's the part that's not happiness? And finally, on the back of page 3, he gets to it. She's talking about getting back her mother's horrid passion and anger. She was angry at Admiral Haddock. She's angry at Sophie for exposing herself to a man known to be in difficulties, a fortune hunter. And I love the words here. She's exposing herself. She wants Sophie to instantly cease all intercourse with him. And I think this is O'Brien with a little nod and a wink to us here. And she says, if this man ever shows up at their house, he'll be turned away. O'Brien writes, this is from Sophie's mom. What kind of a husband would such a man make? Always wandering off into foreign parts whenever the whim took him and attacking people in that rash way. Some folk may cry up her precious Lord Nelson, but did Sophie wish to share poor Lady Nelson's fate? Did she know what a mistress meant? Not to mention her sacred obligation to her mother, does she not know about religion? And for all they knew, Aubrey already had liaisons in every port and many natural children all over. And Stephen realizes that this is when the tears really accelerate because he's having a really hard time reading all this blotted stuff. But he does make out her saying that she will wait for forever if need be, and she's quite sure that Jack will too. And he loves her very affectionately. Yours, gotta run, get this in the post. And he's like, okay, I'm filled in. And he's pretty exhausted, but he's got a letter from Jack as well.
Right. And he turns to Jack's letter. I love how the text says, with a yawn. Stephen's like, okay, I've read enough of the emotional outpourings of one person. Now I'm probably going to have to read the same again from the other side of this. Oh my God. Okay, pass me the letter. So with this yawn, he opens up this letter, lies down on the bed, pulls the candle close, and the letter is datelined September the 12th, 1804, the Lively at sea. And Jack goes on asking Stephen to wish him joy. You'll never guess the good news. And Stephen says, yes, brother, I think I can. And if I was giving this news, I wouldn't use so many exclamation points. Never mind. Jack says he has the best part of a wife, her heart. And he goes on to describe Miss Williams, meaning Sophie, in the most intolerably tedious way. And Stephen thinks, yeah, I know her better than you. Cut to the chase here. Jack says, she's straightforward. She has no damn purses, tricks. She's like a 32-pounder. And Stephen wonders himself, did you just really liken your beloved to a 32-pound cannon? Anyway, he's tired, like we said. The lines are starting to swim, and he scans ahead in this letter. Jack says that he must himself not speak disrespectfully about his putative mother-in-law, but... And Stephen wonders what Jack thinks putative might actually mean. Putative means generally considered or reputed to be, rather than, it probably means potential or prospective. So Jack's slightly missing out on his correct usage there. He skips ahead to saying, join me at Falmouth, Plymouth, Convoy, Madeira, Cape Verdes, coconut trees, and all of this stuff tumbling out of the letter here. And Stephen falls asleep with this going through his mind. Coconut trees, immeasurably tall palms, waving. Deus ex machina. Now, as you're reading this along, maybe like I did, you think, whoa, wait, hold on a second. Where did Deus ex machina come from? A Deus ex machina being, in strictly translating as a god from the overhead crane, meaning in drama, a device whereby something or some person is dropped into the scene to solve a plotting problem by an unexpected or unlikely occurrence. You've got to wonder where this idea of Deus ex machina is coming from, whether it's coming from something he's read in Sophie or Jack's letters, or it's something else that pops into his brain as he drops off to sleep. And Mike, while Stephen sleeps the deep, undisturbed sleep of the exhausted but righteous, maybe we should all just go and take a rest. Let's grab 40 winks and a power nap, and we'll be right back after this short break. If you're enjoying the podcast, please come and join our supporters on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/LoversHole.
Welcome back from the break. We're back to the God in the Machine, but we'll come back as Stephen wakes in daylight from a deep, undisturbed sleep, rereads the letters over breakfast, and drinks to Jack and Sophie's happiness. Now he's busy decoding his paper, drawing up a summary, and in his diary, once he's got his intelligence agent things in order, he writes, all happiness is a good. But if theirs is to be bought by years of waiting and perhaps disgrace, then even this may come too dear. Might be too high a price for this good of happiness for them. J.A., he writes, is older than he was by far, perhaps as mature as it is in his nature to be. But he is only a man, and celibacy will never do for him. Lord Nelson once said, once past Gibraltar, every man is a bachelor. And Stephen's wondering, what's going to come out of a warm climate? We're going to the West Indies here, unscrupulous young women, for this man who eats way too much, who has high animal spirits. He says, what happens if Jack has a renewed fire, a renewed challenge, maybe even a renewed challenge from Diana? And then Stephen writes, no, if no Deus ex machina appears at this interesting juncture, the whole turns into a sad, long drawn out, ultimately squalid tragedy. So Stephen's saying something has got to intervene here to save Jack and Sophie. But he's thinking to himself, Lord Melville is nearly gone. He's not going to be able to save himself unless he reveals facts about the secret funds. So he can't defend himself. He can't defend his friends without compromising the whole intelligence effort of the British Navy. And Stephen then has a little NB, a little postscript, a nota bene, that he slept over 9 hours without a drop of laudanum, unparalleled, and that he's off to the Admiralty.
Right. So that means his spirits have been lifted. And we're getting a little bit of anticipation. Something new is coming. Deus Ex Machina was dropped in to Stephen's kind of reverie at the end of the previous half of this episode. He's now in high spirits and can sleep without laudanum, despite the fact that he's just had his heart broken by Diana. What possibly could be brewing? Well, what we get next starts to answer that question. It's a conversation with Sir Joseph, who, as he meets Stephen, has got shaving cream on his face. And there's clearly a hurry of stuff going on in Sir Joseph's life. He says, we've been really anxious to see you. Mendoza, their agent, had been taken. And Stephen waves this off. He says, Mendoza, he had nothing on me. The only valuable knowledge that he could betray is already useless. So we just get a little kind of reminder in passing that Stephen's work as a spy brings him into danger, but that he's okay, it seems to be for the time being. We learn the big news. Spain is coming into the war. Sir Joseph is very interested in this, asks whether this news represents a firm commitment. Stephen says, remember, he's been on his trip to Catalonia and Spain and been to see the Abbe Montserrat. It is. They are both wholly engaged, and this is why he had called on Sir Joseph so late the previous night. And Sir Joseph regrets deeply that he and the First Lord had missed him at the time when he came to call. So Stephen produces his written report. He has information about the armament that's being prepared in Spain, about the ships being readied, how they have 6 months' stores aboard. There are Spanish regiments stationed in each port. There's information there about their commanding officers. Stephen doesn't place such great reliance on information that came from items marked interrogation. So he's skeptical of interrogation as a source, which is a theme that I think has occupied intelligence gatherers in time of war all the way through history. There's a list of French regiments that are on the march. And Sir Joseph really appreciates factual, detailed intelligence, not impressions and hearsay. And Stephen's doing a great job of distinguishing what he supposes from what he observes for sure. And he says, that Sir Joseph does, that this corresponds very closely with what we have from Admiral Cochrane. And by the way, Mike, the name Cochrane makes our ears prick up. That's probably Admiral Sir Alexander Cochrane, the uncle of the Thomas Cochrane, who is the model for the naval character of Jack Aubrey that we all kind of know and love. So there were many naval and military Cochranes, and this is that one, I think.
Yeah. And Stephen responds, he says, you know what? Yeah, it does correspond, and it might be a little too perfect a correspondence. He's thinking back to Mendoza, this agent. He says, he was intelligent, an intelligent agent, but he was one who was paid. He was a professional. And so, I can't vouch for everything that's in here, but I think it's all highly probable. He says, but he can personally vouch for what has been settled between Paris and Madrid. This Stephen has gotten from enough sources that he feels really good about it. He says, Madrid has been under pressure, and now Godoy, a Spanish politician, we can come back to him later, has yielded, but Spain won't declare until treasure ships reach Cadiz from Montevideo. And without the 5,810,000 pieces of eight that they're sailing with, Spain is very nearly bankrupt. Stephen names the ships that are bringing the treasure: the Medea, 40 guns, Fama, Clara, and Mercedes, 34 guns. And the Fama is supposed to be an uncommonly swift sailor. But all these ships are very well spoken of. They're under the command of Rear Admiral Don Jose Bustamante, a capable and determined officer. They're expected in Cadiz in early October. And then Madrid will declare war upon the news the treasure is landed, the Sarastro incident being the casus belli, that is the occasion for war, the act that justifies or provokes going to war. Without the treasure, Stephen reports, Madrid will be so embarrassed that a rising in Catalonia, supported by our vessels now off Toulon, would have every likelihood of success. So we see a great payoff for England, great intelligence coup, and a great personal payoff for Matron and England. This idea that, Catalonia might now be, if we can get those treasure ships or stop them arriving, wow, lots of good things happening. Spain doesn't go in with France, Catalonia independence.
Right. And here's the Deus Ex Machina that Stephen was mentioning. This is the thing that might actually come out from behind the woodwork, as it were, to solve the problems of many of the characters in this story, especially Jack Aubrey. And Stephen is kind of realizing that this situation has that role to play as a way of sort of apologizing to himself for kind of jumping in and fixing it all. By the way, this is all dead on real world stuff. The treasure ships, the names of the ships, the fact that the Lively was involved in intercepting them, all of this, as we'll come to discuss, was part of the real world history of this particular story. Manuel de Godoy, this Godoy who's mentioned, was the former Prime Minister / First Secretary of State of Spain. He was given the title Prince of Peace as the result of having helped his country to avoid a financially ruinous war against France back in 1795 when Spain had become neutral. And in 1804, he was blackmailed, or you might say bribed, into joining France in her war against England yet again. So no longer quite the Prince of Peace, at least not by the time we get to the events that are going to be described in this book. The Sarastro incident, Mike, we've got no idea whether that has any kind of real historical reference behind it. We've looked through the Reddit world, we've looked through the gun room. The character Sarastro was the king or the high priest in Mozart's The Magic Flute, an opera, well, almost an opera about darkness and light. Sarastro was the antagonist to the Dark Queen. And compared to O'Brien's signature Mozart opera, which is The Marriage of Figaro, Magic Flute is something else. It's not quite an opera. It's more like a musical comedy. They call it a Singspiel. It's, you'd say, middle-brow rather than highbrow. It's got fantastic music in it. It's not a second-rate piece of Mozart, but it is something less than quite an opera. We might come back to that in a moment. You can listen to the opera. You can go and read up on the plot synopsis for yourself, but just think about it for a minute. On the one hand, it's not prime O'Brien Mozart territory. It's in German. It has images and symbolism from Freemasonry. Not exactly, therefore, O'Brien home territory. But wait, there are themes of jealousy and intrigue. There are malign dark forces. There are lovers driven to suicidal despair by the apparent crushing of their hope for true love. There are men having to go through trials to prove that they're deserving of their brides. Perhaps this is sounding a bit more like Aubrey Maturin than you might first think.
Well, Sir Joseph can't thank Stephen enough. He's going to let Lord Melville and Mr. Pitt know immediately. He leaves, and Stephen looks over, and Sir Joseph had left his untasted coffee. Stephen pours it into his cup. So Joseph comes back, says Melville is going to still be in this inquiry, this kind of ongoing investigation about him for hours, but they need to act immediately. He sent a note in, and Stephen asks if Sir Joseph means to take decisive action. And Sir Joseph assures him, I absolutely do, but it's going to have to be a cabinet decision. And then Stephen says, well, how's the inquiry with Lord Melville going? And Sir Joseph says it's badly. In honor, he cannot account for the secret funds. And a lot of his enemies who know about the secret funds and have been involved in that for intelligent matters know this too. And they're taking advantage of that and using it against him. But then we switch to another side of Sir Joseph that I think is going to play long in the canon, but one I think we're first hearing about. And interestingly, a little callback to Stephen in Doc earlier. But let you take this, Ian.
It's great. So Joseph is an entomologist. He's a scholar of the world of insects. And he asks Stephen, what news from the other world, meaning the world of nature and science? And Stephen remembers he has a gift for Sir Joseph and says, great news. And as he pulls out his pocketbook and opens it, he shows him an insect that had been found by an ingenious priest. And it says they found him or her or them, and he's referring to the insect that was found, very diplomatically making use of pronouns almost as if it was 2024. So Joseph is astounded to see a true gynandromorph, that is to say, an example of the species, an example of a clouded yellow butterfly that is on one side laterally perfectly male and laterally on the other side perfectly female, which, as you say, Mike, is a nice hark back to the epicene, sexually ambiguous people that Stephen had seen on the street. We also know that this is home territory for O'Brien because he loved the natural world. He was a biographer of the great scientist and discoverer Sir Joseph Banks, so this was a really easy reference for O'Brien to drop in, and it's going to come back. We're going to know and love this side of Sir Joseph's character all the way through the canon. So, taking advantage of this moment of mutual obligation and friendship and warmth, Stephen pitches one of his asks, as you might say in modern business talk. can I speak, he asks, in an unofficial or semi-official way about my friend Captain Aubrey? And Sir Joseph says, yes, you mean Lucky Jack Aubrey, and mentions with lots of excitement the Fanciulla action that's very well known about. Stephen wants Sir Joseph's advice on Jack's prospects for employment. So Joseph says, well, Lord Melville, the First Lord, has a regard for him, but is likely to have left before he, Melville, can do what he'd like to do for Captain Aubrey. And without Lord Melville, with any kind of partial change in the administration, there are going to be objections against the services and the claims of the excellent Captain Aubrey. Like, for example, his father in Parliament, whose every speech is worth 5 votes to the other side, and General Aubrey gives a great many speeches. And this is disheartening. So Stephen thanks him and says, yeah, that's pretty much what I thought. Now, they go on talking for a while about butterflies and beetles, and they get to talking about Cimarosa. So we've had Malta, we've had Mozart, and now we have our third musical reference, the Italian composer Domenico Cimarosa. And there's a performance of an opera called Le Astuzie Femminili at Covent Garden that Sir Joseph is very, very enthusiastic about, encourages Stephen to go and hear it. Even so, Sir Joseph's mind is clearly elsewhere, and his eye keeps wandering to a clock. Now, we'll hear it in a moment, Stephen's response to this opera. Cimarosa did really write an opera called Feminine Wiles, or Le Astuzie Femminili, and it really was actually performed in London in 1804. So that's a great reference. It's quite a nice name, Feminine Wiles. Maybe that's meant to have some reference for us. We need to sort of see through the Italian translation enough to get it. It is a farce. It's a very, very silly piece. There are daughters left fortunes by their fathers. There are people who want to marry having been promised to their housekeeper. It's all kind of light-hearted comedy of romantic manners type stuff. And we're going to hear, as I say, what Stephen thinks about it later on. Again, I don't think Cimarosa's work is... I've not listened to very much of it. It's not famous for being particularly great. O'Brien's obviously got a reason for choosing it here. He could, if you wanted to use a really well-known Cimarosa reference, you could have chosen his opera The Secret Marriage, which is probably the one whose title at least most people have heard of, but maybe an opera called The Secret Marriage. That would have been a bit too much on the nose for where we are now in the story, what with Jack and Sophie and all the rest of it. Anyhow, the aged clerk whom Sir Joseph had sent out earlier on, this clerk returns 10 years younger, skipping with a note and darts out. Sir Joseph announces what's happening. We act. He rings several bells, sends for several files. This is classic civil service drama, right? But somebody once said about the West Wing, the dramatic point of the West Wing is getting the president to sign a piece of paper. And now we have Sir Joseph Blaine's drama. He rings bells, he sends for people, he sends for files, he looks for ships, he has copy clerks and messengers standing by, all of his kind of apparatus coming into life here. Meanwhile, the First Lord, who's still in post, Lord Melville, sends his particular compliments and begs that he himself might have a word with Dr. Maturin at 11:20 precisely. So, Mike, in this conversation between Sir Joseph and Stephen, all kinds of things have transpired. And Stephen seems to have lit a bit of a fire underneath, well, something. We need to find out what the something is.
Well, Sir Joseph asks if Dr. Maturin will accompany the squadron, since a negotiation might be possible, and a negotiation might be much better than what he calls, he says in French, the manfort, meaning kind of literally strong hand, but here meaning brute force. Instead of blowing each other up, if we could negotiate a settlement, this would be great. And Stephen says, I will go, but I don't want to be exposed as an agent. So you need to have somebody there who speaks Spanish, and I will brief him so that he can then go talk to their rear admiral. He asked Blaine to be sure to send a very powerful squadron, ships of the line, and that will allow Bustamante to yield with honor. Otherwise, he's going to fight like a lion, and he has very highly trained, highly disciplined Spanish ships to be reckoned with. So Joseph says, good, thanks, good counsel. Do you have any other counsel or request? And Stephen begs a favor, and he couches this saying, I've never accepted anything for my services, in spite of the Admiralty's very obliging insistent. And Sir Joseph looks a little grave hearing this, and I can almost read his mind going, we're in the midst of an inquiry about secret funds, is Stephen about to ask for a big payout with all this great intelligence that would be well worth it here? And Stephen says, I would like to request that Captain Aubrey in the Lively form part of the squadron. And Sir Joseph looks completely relieved. He says, is that all it? That's all you want? And he says, I can do that. I can do that on my own responsibility. And I think Lord Melville will be delighted because it might be the last thing he can do for his young friend. And Sir Joseph says, well, that can't be all you want, Stephen. What else? What else? And Stephen says, that is all, sir. You oblige me most extremely. I'm deeply obliged to you, Sir Joseph. And I think, Ian, while the treasure ship may be the big ghost in the machine, I think Stephen's request here may be the little ghost in the machine for Jack and Sophie. How Stephen would say, I have got to get Jack out of the West Indies. I got to get him in a position. I got to make sure these two have a little bit more happily ever after. I'm going to play this card. Never ask for anything. I'm going to ask for it. Well,
very good.
Yeah. Sir Joseph says Dr. Matra needs to go along with Aubrey. And then he's thinking to himself, but the Lively has a surgeon. I can't supersede the surgeon. But you know what, Stephen, you've got to have a temporary rank. You know what? I'm going to take care of it. I will figure it out. I'm going to send it along with full instructions this evening. It's going to take a while to write those all out. And then I'll send them to you. You can go along with the messenger as he takes the full instructions to the Lively, tonight.
So Stephen returns to the grapes and he sits there half asleep. It's been a busy day and he's pretty exhausted. A message coming from Sir Joseph aroused him, as the text says, from his delicious sense of inhabiting a body with indefinite woolen bounds, that feeling of being all kind of cocooned in sleep. Stephen realizes that he hasn't eaten since he took a biscuit and a glass of Madeira with Lord Melville. He sends for a pot of tea and a large number of crumpets, which is exactly the right amount of crumpets in my book. A large number of crumpets that he can eat while he's reading this message. The Lively then is going to be sent, and it says in the message here, in compliment to Dr. Maturin, he had given orders that the temporary commission, meaning a temporary rank of captain, in this case I think for Stephen, should be modelled as closely as possible upon that granted to Sir J. Banks of the Royal Society, which he hoped might give pleasure. And enclosed with this note is a commission, large and entirely handwritten, not a pro forma because it was done in such a hurry and also it's such a rarity. The full instructions, the message says, won't be ready until after midnight. So Sir Joseph encloses a ticket for Stephen to go and see Le Astuzie Femminili. This is the Feminine Wiles, this Cimarosa opera. And Mike, this is quite a downbeat moment, I think, for Stephen. He's been on a high, dealing with all of his espionage stuff, dealing with his Deus Ex Machina to rescue Jack and Sophie, putting Jack and Sophie together on the ship. But finally, I think we're going to get a sense of where Stephen is really at now that he's at the opera.
Yeah. He's up in this small, expensive box that Sir Joseph has bought the ticket for. And he looks down upon the audience mostly and also the stage. And he leans, his hands still greasy from the crumpets, on the padded edge. And I love this. This is so Stephen Maturin. And he's looking down at what O'Brien writes as the groundlings, his fellows on almost every other occasion. But he's looking at them with some degree of spiritual as well as physical loftiness up here. And he sees pretty much all of London that attends to music appears to be here tonight. The lights darken, the music starts, and we get this refrain again, as we did with Moulter. This poor, thin, pompous, overblown stuff, he thought, not unpleasant, but quite trivial. What was Sir Joseph thinking of to compare this man to Mozart? And then there's this flash of light, and to his right, these latecomers are entering the box, and Stephen thinks, Goths, Moorish barbarity. He says, not that he really had to concentrate on the music or that the music had so much to say, but he says, it would have been all one to those grass-combing Huns had it been Orpheus in person. Even if Orpheus had been on stage, they wouldn't have cared. And I thought to myself, Ian, whoa, Orpheus, this poet, who could entrance wild beasts with his beautiful singing and playing, he went to the underworld after the death of his wife to secure her release but he lost her
Ah.
because he couldn't obey the condition that he must not look upon her face until they reached the world of the living. He looked at her before, and boom, she couldn't come out. And I will note, for those of you who've been with us for a while, and for those of us looking ahead, we'll hear about Orpheus again in The Surgeon's Mate.
Ooh, stick a big, old, long-winded pin in that one. Yeah, very good, very good. Huh. Stephen now notices the music once again. Two charming harps he notices running, signifying nothing, pleasant, just like he found with the Malta earlier on. So he asks himself, why was his heart oppressed, filled with an anxious foreboding, a dread of something imminent that he could not define? The girl singing on stage has a sweet, true little voice, and it is as pretty as God and art can make her, but Stephen takes no pleasure in it, and he finds that his hands are sweating. And here's a bit of real introspection from Stephen. A foolish German had said that man thought in words. It was totally false, a pernicious doctrine. The thought flashed into being 100 simultaneous forms with 1,000 associations, and the speaking mind selected one, forming it grossly into the inadequate symbol of words, inadequate because common to disparate situations, admitted to be inadequate for vast regions of expression, since for them there were the parallel languages of music and painting. So it's a really great quote. Stephen is thinking really, really deeply. This phrase, man thinks in words, Mike, that's a particular reference, right?
Well, I thought it would be, and I'm thinking Kant, Leibniz, these could be, our usual suspects, but I couldn't find an exact quote. Now, Samuel Johnson, not German, said language is the dress of thought,
Yeah.
and there is a similar German expression, man denkt in seiner Sprache, one thinks in one's language, acknowledging kind of the role that language plays in shaping our thoughts, but I couldn't find that one exactly.
Right. And we've got a contrast here with Mozart, the genius. Mozart thinks purely in music. And Stephen, at that particular moment, as he's sitting there reflecting, is thinking in scent. So we're back to this idea of synesthesia again for people who are thinking about artistic experiences. And he notices that the house burst into a roar of applause as there's an obvious climax in the music. And as this takes place, Stephen sees Diana in the latecomers box. She's clapping politely. She has no great enthusiasm. She's looking behind her, not at the stage. And here's Stephen's point of view of this unexpected vision of Diana. Her head was turned in a curve he would have recognized in an even greater crowd. Her long white gloves, pointing upwards, beat steadily together as she talked over the general din, her expression and the movements of her head pushing her meaning through the noise. And she's sitting next to a woman who is Lady Jersey, and next to them is Canning. There are also two officers in scarlet and gold, therefore army officers, and a civilian, a minor royal, with the ribbon of the garter across his chest. That's the man that Diana's speaking to. And Stephen watches this scene with no particular emotion. He'd noticed the great leap that his heart took. He'd noticed the disorder of his breathing. And then he realized that he'd been aware of her presence from the start and that her scent had been running through his mind while he was reflecting on the music and on the harps. The applause stops, and Stephen sees that Diana is still moving her right hand as she talks to the man behind her. He's shocked to see for himself how she's moving it with a conscious grace, like she's kind of putting something into this gesture. And of course, it was this kind of grace, the unconscious grace, the easygoing, non-forced version of grace that had been a big part of Stephen's original feeling of attraction towards her. The door of the box that she's sitting in opens, and another man appears, another member of the Order of the Garter, and the women all stand up and bob. And Mike, there are two things on my mind here about these guys with the Order of the Garter. One is that in a non-spoilering way, I can say we're going to have a serious antagonist sometime in the future who wears the Order of the Garter. And we're both sitting there thinking, ooh, I wonder if he's one of them. In which case, O'Brien is playing some seriously long ball. And also, I suspect that the one who's made them stand up, who's wearing the Order of the Garter, might well be the Prince Regent, who's going to become the king. The Prince of Wales, in other words. Sorry, not the Regent. Yeah. Going to become, I guess, King George IV. Especially given the proximity of Lady Jersey, who we heard about a couple of seconds ago.
Right.
Anyhow, Stephen can't see the face of this man to confirm that it's who he suspects it is, but he sees the essential change in the way that Diana is. And here's how O'Brien describes it. Her whole movement, from the carriage of her head to the pretty flirt of her ostrich fan, was subtly altered. And Mike, this is not going to be the last time, I think, that Stephen reflects on an altered state, on an altered perception that he has of Diana, and it's almost always a heart-wrenching agony for him to see these changes in her, how she is with him, and how she is with other people. So anyhow, this little scene in the box wraps up. There are bows and bobs, and the gartered man, whoever he was, takes his leave.
And it's interesting, like you were saying a minute ago, Ian, this whole idea, I think, is running through both of our heads going, ooh, could it be? Could it be? Could it be?
Yeah.
Well, because there's this moment now, the man, Stephen's watching Diana's box, but that man reappears in another box close by. And I'm thinking, oh, okay, so here we're going to find out. And it says Stephen pays no attention to him and doesn't care if he's the Duke of Hell. And I thought, Duke of Hell, in the Patrick O'Brien Muster book says, wow, it's just a curse that Stephen uses. I'm thinking, nah, the guy we're going to meet somewhere in the future is the Duke of Hell. So
Very
I
true.
don't know. I'm like you.
That's a good way to put it.
We'll just find out. But
Yeah.
Stephen is paying no attention to this. He hasn't read that far in the canon yet. He has all his attention focused on Diana to prove what he now knows to be true. And it's exactly what you were saying. We remember he was speculating earlier in this chapter about virtue and grace being kind of, even above virtue, this natural grace, not this affected, way of doing things. O'Brien tells it, he extracts the last drag of pain from the knowledge of the spectacle. So like you say, it's just killing Stephen. Diana is, as O'Brien writes, on display. The purity of wild grace was gone, and the thought that from now on he must associate vulgarity with his idea of her was so painful that for a while he could not think clearly. Yeah. And I don't know whether this is Stephen, probably O'Brien telling us that, people who don't know her well wouldn't have noticed this,
Right.
nor people who valued that purity less. Stephen, values it above all things, I think.
Right.
It doesn't detract from the admiration of all the men in the audience or her companions in the box because she does it so instinctively. So somebody for less of an eye might miss this. But O'Brien finishes, but the woman in the box over there was not one to whom he would have paid any attention at any time. And I'm thinking, this is it. So that there was something in Diana that has caught Stephen the entire time. And he's saying, this Diana, yeah, I never would have picked her out of a crowd at all. And boy, that's kind of a resounding note of finality to me on this Stephen and Diana. But I know how emotions are. Mindfulness has taught me.
Right.
They move around a little
They
bit.
surely do. And it's funny, we often talk about people in stories having the feeling that someone's watching them. And it's an odd little twist here that just as Stephen decides that Diana's not worth looking at, that we switch to her perspective as she's having that odd feeling of either being looked at or not being looked at, whichever the feeling is. But she certainly feels uneasy. And we notice that she looks around the auditorium here. Stephen drops his eyes like he would if he were stalking a doe. He's consciously avoiding any kind of eye contact. There are people staring at her because, of course, to the rest of the world, she's still Diana Villiers and she's still a beautiful woman. She is probably actually the finest woman in the house. Despite Stephen dropping his eyes, their eyes do meet somehow. And she stops talking. And he has the intention of standing up and bowing, but the power has gone from his legs and he's bowled over by this sudden paralysis that comes over him. Before he can grip the pad in front of him and raise himself up, the performance begins again. The curtain goes up and we're back to racing harps. And again, Mike, this is a really strong signifier of Stephen being badly struck, badly smitten in his relationship with Diana. He feels like it's final. He feels like his view of her has changed. His physical strength seems to have just been chopped out from under him. We're going to see this more times later on in the canon, but for now, this is post-Captain, and this is the first time Stephen's ever noticed feeling like this. He's felt sick, he's been nauseous before, but he's never had this lack of control over his body. And he wonders to himself in the text, did the Diana I last saw at New Place ever exist, in fact? A creation of my own? Can you create a unicorn by longing? What a brilliant question. We'll come back to that in a second. There's a persistent knocking, though, at his box door because time is going by. Throughout all the music and the caterwauling on the stage, the knocking continues. He ignores it, and it stops. Had he had, now he's asking himself internally, had he had a hand in her death? And I guess, Mike, he means the death of her character, the death of her grace.
Right.
He shook his head to deny it. And again, he's using a physical kind of head shaking gesture to try and clear himself of this terrible thought.
And, I'm thinking right here, that knocking, that pounding at his door, that's Diana.
Right.
I think she's come to find him. And he's so caught up thinking about this. And then she leaves. And then O'Brien says, had he had a hand in her death? I'm thinking, oh my gosh, right? Oh, wow.
Right.
Wow.
Oh, dear me. And it seems like the rest of the performance is going to carry on in this dazed sort of catatonic state for Stephen because, well, the next thing we know, time to go home, right?
Right. The curtain comes down, the lights go up. Stephen kind of looks out. Diana's gone from her box, but a pair of long white gloves are drooped over the plush in the front of her box. And I'm wondering myself, I don't think Diana left those, forgot those. I think she left those on purpose. Is it, her hoping that Stephen, being the gentleman that he is going to retrieve them and return them to her, despite her behavior. She's always done this. Oh, Stephen, you still have to be nice to me.
I wonder if they carry a waft of scent about them.
Oh gosh, don't you know that they do? Oh my gosh. Well, Stephen just sits there in his box until finally, everybody's gone. The people that are picking up the rubbish and putting out the lights are moving through. And two of these people, O'Brien writes the dialogue between them here. There's still a gent there up in the box. Is he drunk? Perhaps he thinks there's another act, but there ain't no more, thank God. Come, sir, they said, opening the door with their little key. It's all over now. This is the end of the piece. End of chapter 14, part 1.
Wow.
Whew.
It's all over now. This is the end of the piece. On so many levels, right? It's the end of this moment. It's the end, apparently, of Stephen's love for Diana in many respects, at least as far as he sees it right now.
I kept running these lines through my head. I thought, this is just incredible writing. Is he drunk? Well, that would be a throwaway line, except remember, that's exactly what Jack said when he saw Stephen with his narwhal horn and his umbrella. I thought, okay, we're seeing an echo of that.
Yeah.
And, perhaps this is Stephen just as ludicrous at that moment as he is now, seeing Diana and having his feelings change so dramatically to someone who he would never have paid attention to, yet he can't stand up and bow. Boy, you can almost imagine the sense and sensibility in his brains and his reason and emotion just tearing like wet newspaper, in his heart and his brain. And then, Brian says, in the words of these guys cleaning up, perhaps he thinks there is another act. And I'm thinking, I'm sure that's running, I don't think it's in the opera, though. I think it's between Diana and Stephen.
Yeah.
But there ain't no more, thank God. Whoa, who's thinking there ain't no more? And who's thinking, thank God? Like maybe, Stephen, you don't know what this woman would do to you here. But who knows? And, is this Stephen's thinking? Is this Diana's thinking with her gloves draped over so Stephen can see them? Is this Stephen who can't stand up? Come, sir, it's all over now. this is the end of the piece. And that, Ian, you were just touching on that so exactly right, and I kept
Yeah.
wondering to myself, is that O'Brien talking to Stephen, talking to us?
Right.
I don't know, or just this pause that I'm thinking, what? And there's still like half a chapter to go, but man, for me, this was like done.
Really big
Wow.
moment. Oh, it's good, good. And we've said a few times already in earlier chapters that there's a dream quality or a dream theme going on all the way through this. And I love that moment that we got to a few paragraphs ago. Can you create a unicorn by longing? Like, has Stephen
Ooh,
dreamt up a fantastical version of Diana? Was it all a dream, to use a kind of trashy fiction trope? Was it all a dream when he woke up?
right.
Well, the fact that his legs don't work, the fact that something's wrong with him in the physical world suggests that it's not. Ah,
It's probably not, although I will testify looking back over my life, I've dreamed up many a unicorn out of
oh yes.
nothing. So, and tons of therapy, barely gotten me, I guess, to the point where I can at least spot that maybe that's going on from time to time.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Ah,
And he listen. He won't listen to. He'll turn away from the knocking on the door of the real Diana.
yes.
He's
Yeah.
kind of stuck, locked in the empty. It's all over, Diana.
Wow.
So, a dark, empty, cold note has come over Stephen here. This is one of those really great pieces of existential Stephenism that we get written about from time to time. Like you say, Mike, it points a really great moment up in this chapter here. But let's not forget that the chapter's not over, and Stephen and Diana are not the only couple on any kind of a journey here, right? Jack, at the end of the previous chapter, had said that he felt it was wrong of him to pursue Sophie, and he seemed to write that off as a hopeless cause. He's got nothing to offer her, he says, at the moment, especially if Melville's displaced as First Lord. But now he seems intent on moving heaven and earth to make a really great impression. All of a sudden, he's oblivious to his officers and crew's opinion. He's, ordering up the chinoiserie in the best possible taste. And turning, what was it, a funeral parlor and a boudoir? I can't remember what he said it was.
Right.
Is he just, I don't know, afraid of being rejected as he had been with Diana? Is he still afraid of having his heart torn to pieces because he'd given words to that sentiment at the end of the previous chapter? Similarly, on Sophie's side, she's got lots of reasons for not pursuing Jack, and the material ones are the ones that we've talked about. There's also the fact that he's clearly been doing his own thing with Diana and not taken very great care that doesn't cause hurt to Sophie. But Sophie's showing what Stephen has called her bottom, her character, her fortitude. Stephen knew about that even before he'd lost his faith in Diana. And Sophie, although I think she is afraid of being hurt, is really showing courage. Out of the four of them, I think she's the one with the most genuinely steadfast courage and kind of purity of purpose. And think that she's doing that in the context of being a single unmarried woman in the 18th century or early 19th century with not a lot of leverage and not a lot of status in society. So I'm very much team Sophie at this point.
So many times, we see O'Brien writing these women as what they do to get by in that time and place. Because I mean, clearly, heading solo, she knows not only that her mom's going to lose her mind, but and did, but that everybody could call her out. This could be a real indiscretion. You were alone with this guy, forget Diana going into keeping. Look at what you're doing here. But it's interesting. Stephen momentarily lost his faith in Sophie, and I think that really crushed him. It's like, look, of all of us, Sophie, I kind of was my rock a little bit here, and now Diana disappears. Stephen seems to take it almost mortally when Sophie doesn't pursue Jack, won't go along with his plans at the beginning of the chapter, and then, because of that, we get all that long commentary on Plymouth and Doc, and most of it seems to be coming from Stephen's state of mind, not just about Diana, but because of Sophie and that combination.
Yeah.
It seems to have taken the light and the color and the scent from his world, not to mention the grace and the virtue that were so important here. I do think he loves them both dearly. He loves Jack dearly. He loves Sophie dearly. He loves Diana dearly, or he did. And that accounts, I think, for a lot of that loss there.
Yeah.
I think that a number of Stephen's ideas, all this talk that we've had this chapter and before, Master and Commander, independence, virtue, grace, life, happiness. He's suffering in these, perhaps because of his emotional state, perhaps compounded with what he and Jack had gone through. And, we haven't come back to that. We haven't had the two of them kind of reflect on the fact that they were about to kill one another or one to another. And I guess, maybe I'm wrong to call them out for not talking about it. Maybe that's too 21st century male. We're speaking about 18th century females. You guys need to talk about this. No, we don't talk about things like that.
Well, I'll give them a tiny sliver of credit for maybe they did talk about it. Maybe they did talk about it as it were off camera.
Maybe they did. Maybe we'll have it come up again. No spoilers here.
And Mike, we talked earlier on in the episode about the choice of music, and that maybe there's a common theme between the choice of the Cimarosa opera and the Malta trumpet concerto, and maybe even the Magic Flute. These are pieces of music that are not quite all that you might want. Cimarosa and Malta, because to be honest, they're not first-rank composers, and Stephen notices that in his reflections on the performances that he hears. The Magic Flute, because it's not quite an opera. As we said, it's something slightly other than an opera. Maybe Stephen has to accept in music, and perhaps also in life, that he's not going to get quite the ultimate desire of his heart. Maybe other people are going to be needing to deal with not first choice. Jack and Stephen, maybe they're going to have to deal with each other's limitations as friends. Maybe Sophie and Mrs. Williams are going to have to deal with the limitations of the available husband material on the scene here. Not everybody's going to get something that's of the highest perfection. And Mike, that sounds like a good lesson for life, right? A lot of what we get in life is not perfect. It's a curate's egg, or to use a 20th century reference, it's a dead parrot with lovely plumage.
Well, and I think it kind of came through a little bit. He would go, "Oh, there's not much going here." But it does set up the trumpet well. Well, oh my gosh, what was Sir Joseph talking about? Well, listen to that woodwind. Take a look at that. And it's like, I think that's a little bit of that. You got to find it in there, right? Yeah. It's not all roses and sunshine. Yeah. Or never mind, a bad reference, right? Well, despite Jack's high spirits and Stephen's sort of God in the machine intervention with the Admiralty to get Jack into the squadron pursuing the Spanish treasure ships, I think we still have to remember their political forces arrayed against Jack, and with the changing partial administration, his father, oh my gosh, is still working against him. And even with all the plot changes in this half chapter, we have to wonder, does Jack really get the chance for another mega prize? I mean, there's a part of me that says that sounds a little bit too happily ever after for our heroes, especially for this author, Patrick O'Brian. But,
and maybe that's where the reference to Deus Ex Machina comes from. He's kind of teasing himself for being about perhaps to deploy something that's a little bit too much of a happily ever after.
Yeah. And he might be setting us up to say, you think that's where it's going, don't you?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right.
Well, Mike, some people have said that Chapter 14 of Post Captain is one of the best in the entire canon, but we're only halfway through. I think to complete our judgment on whether this holds up or not, I suppose there's only one way to find out. With Part 2, the closing half chapter of Post Captain coming up, what do you say to just a little bit more Patrick O'Brian?
Oh, I should like that of all things.
his view of the poorhouse with all of the filth and the cruelty and the bestiality. Sorry, not the bestiality.
Whoops.
No
There
bestiality
you go.
here. At least
There's
not-
our outtake, brother.
not on his face. With its filth, cruelty, and bestial ignorance.